Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into a chess opening known for its strategic elegance and, well, its lasting relevance, the Catalan.
Yes, the Catalan. A truly fascinating system for white, isn't it? It's been, a cornerstone of top-level chess for almost a century now. So many complex battles.
Exactly. And we've gathered quite a few sources to help us dig into it. We'll be looking at Wikipedia for an overview, but also some deeper works like Neil MacDonald's The Catalan New in Chess.
Ah, good one.
And Boris Arukh's big book on the Catalan from Quality Chess, plus perspectives from broader opening books like Argy Keen's Flank Openings.
Right, and we can even touch on how it connects to things in, say, Pavlovic's book on the Nimzo QD systems, or Sam Collins on the Tarrasch defense. Gives a wider picture.
It really does. So our goal for you today is to pull out the essential knowledge about the Catalan. We want to give you a clear sense of its core ideas, its history, which is pretty interesting, and why it's still so important today.
Without getting totally bogged down in endless variations, hopefully.
Exactly. We'll try not to do that, and we'll also see how it links up with other openings you might already know. Okay, let's get started. What fundamentally is the Catalan opening?
Okay, so at its core, the Catalan usually kicks off with 1-point d4, nf6, 2-point c4, e6, 3, g3. The key thing, the absolute defining feature, is white playing g3 and then putting the bishop on g2. That's called a fianchetto.
Right, the fianchetto. So that bishop tucks away on g2.
Uh-huh. And from there, it controls that really long diagonal from h1 to a8. That's the engine, like you said earlier, almost.
So it's not just developing a piece, it's setting up this long-range strategic weapon.
Precisely. It puts pressure on the center, pressure on black's queen side. And what's interesting is how it often comes up. It's often white's way of dealing with black's Indian defenses after 1-point d4, nf6.
Ah, okay. So black plays nf6 and e6, aiming for maybe a Nimzo Indian or Queen's Indian.
And white says, okay, I'll play g3 and challenge that setup directly with my bishop. It's a way to fight for the initiative against those solid black structures.
That makes sense. A kind of strategic counterpunch. And for people who like the technical details, the ECO codes, where does it fit?
Right. The Encyclopedia of Chess Openings codes, they range from E00 to E09 for the Catalan complex. But the most common lines, the ones you see after 1-point d4, nf6, 2-point c4, e6, 3-point g3, d5, and then 4-point bg2. Those are mostly E01 to E09.
E01 to E09, got it. Okay, that gives us a solid definition. Now let's talk history. It has this rather unique origin story, doesn't it? Named after a place.
It does. It's named after Catalonia, the region in Spain. The story goes that it was basically created, or at least formally introduced, in 1929 for the Barcelona tournament.
Created for the tournament?
Well, yeah, the organizers actually asked Savelli Tartakower, a famous player and writer back then, to come up with a new opening variation, sort of a tribute to Catalonia's chess history.
Wow, a bespoke opening. That's amazing. But the idea itself, it wasn't completely brand new in 29, was it? People had played g3 in similar positions.
That's right. Tartakower definitely popularized it and gave it the name, but the underlying idea that g3 fianchetto in response to point e6 had popped up before. There's a game, Ready Leonhardt, from Berlin in 1928 that actually transposed into an open Catalan.
Transposed, meaning it started differently but ended up in a Catalan position.
Exactly. So the concept was floating around, but Tartakower really brought it into the spotlight in Barcelona, and it caught on pretty quickly with the top guys.
Who were some of the early adopters?
Well, in the 1930s and 40s, you saw it used by several world champions, Capablanca, Alekhine, Botvinnik, they all played it, and other strong grandmasters too, like Floor, Kiers, Reshevsky. It became a serious part of elite chess.
That's quite a lineup. Fast forward a bit.
Yeah.
It had a big moment in the 80s too, didn't it, with Kasparov?
Oh, absolutely. The 1983 candidate semifinal match, Kasparov versus Korchnoi, that was huge. The Catalan was played in, I think, 5 out of the 11 games.
5 games in such a critical match.
Yeah, it really put the Catalan back on the map at the highest level, sparked a lot of new interest in analysis.
And people kept recognizing its importance. There was even that anniversary tournament.
Right. In 2004, they held a tournament in Barcelona to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the opening's birth in 1929. Ruben Felgar won that one. A nice nod to its history.
And then even more recently, in the 2010s, we saw another wave, right? Some modern giants picking it up.
We certainly did. Vladimir Kramnik used it a lot through the 2010s, really explored its depths. He even played it in the 2006 World Championship match against Topalov.
And Anand used it too.
Yep, Vishy Anand played it in his 2010 World Championship match, also against Topalov. White actually scored quite well in those Catalan games, which definitely got people's attention.
And then there's Magnus Carlsen. He seems to have made it a core part of his his repertoire.
Absolutely. Carlsen really adopted it as a main weapon, maybe late 2010s onwards. Famously played it in the 2021 World Championship against the Pomniachi, Game 2, I think.
Huh?
And he used it a lot in the Tata Steel tournament in 2022 as well. When the world champion plays something that consistently you know it's got serious strategic bite and holds up to modern scrutiny.
So it really went from this specific request in Barcelona nearly a century ago to being a mainstay for the best players in the world right up to today. Quite a journey. Okay, let's dive into the strategy now. What are the core ideas driving the Catalan?
Okay, strategically.
Yeah.
Well, the first big split is usually between what's called the open Catalan and the closed Catalan. Let's start with the open or classical line. That usually happens after 1.d4, nf6, 2.c4, e6, 3.g3, d5, 4.bg2, dxc4.
Okay, so black actually takes the pawn on c4. That seems bold. Why does white let that happen?
Well, it's a pawn sacrifice, or at least a temporary one. White gives up the c-pawn, but in return gets a lead in development. And crucially, with black's d-pawn gone, that g2 bishop suddenly has this massive open diagonal aimed right at black's queen side.
Okay, so pawn down, but pieces out faster, and the star bishop gets unleashed.
Exactly. White's banking on that development lead and the bishop's pressure to cause black problems. Especially if black tries too hard to hang on to the extra pawn, it creates this dynamic imbalance right away. White wants to use the initiative.
Makes sense. So how does white usually try to get the pawn back or just press the advantage?
Often, white plays moves like nf3, then maybe qc2, preparing to hit c4. Sometimes nf5 comes into play, hitting c4 and eyeing f7. Or even qf4 plus sometimes, trying to regain the pawn quickly.
And black. What's the plan if they decide to keep the pawn?
Well, holding on to that c4 pawn often means playing moves like point a6 and then point b5 to support it. But doing that can weaken the queenside structure, create holes, give white targets later on. It's a real strategic decision for black.
I see. It's a tricky balance. Are there famous proponents of this open line?
Oh yeah. Playing it as black, you had players like Anatoly Karpov and Efim Geller who were masters of defending those positions. And playing it as white, someone like Oleg Romanishin was known for really understanding the white side's initiative.
Interesting. Okay, so that's the open Catalan. What about the closed Catalan? How does that differ?
In the closed Catalan, after 1.d4, nf6, 2.c4, e6, 3.g3, d5, 4.bg2, black chooses not to take the pawn on c4 right away. Instead, they might play something solid like b7 or just castle kingside.
So it's keeping the pawn structure intact in the center.
Right. So white doesn't get that immediate open diagonal for the bishop in the same way. The game takes on a more positional, maneuvering character. White still has the bishop influencing the center, but the fight is different. Maybe white plays nf3, castles, plays qc2, looking for pressure in other ways, maybe preparing a central push or kingside play later.
So the c4 pawn is still there, potentially a source of tension, but the game is less about that immediate capture and more about slower strategic buildup.
Generally, yes, the priority shift. It's less about white's immediate lead in development versus the pawn, and more about long-term positional factors, pawn breaks, piece placement. Still very complex, just a different flavor.
Got it. Now, something else that came up in the sources was a connection to the Tarrasch defense. That seems interesting. How do they link up?
Yeah, that's a really important connection. Sometimes games can actually start looking like a Tarrasch, but end up being a Catalan or vice versa. The Tarrasch often involves moves like 1.d4, d5, 2.c4, e6, and then black plays an early taunt c5, challenging the center immediately.
Right, the Tarrasch is known for black accepting an isolated queen's pawn, or IQP, after taught c5 by d4, followed by xe4.
Exactly. And that theme of black playing .c5 and potentially ending up with an isolated d-pawn, well, that can also happen in certain lines of the Catalan. If black plays an early taunt c5 against the Catalan setup, maybe after white has played g3, you can reach similar structures.
So even though white played g3, which isn't typical Tarrasch, black's .c5 thrust creates a similar strategic battleground focusing on that d5, or potentially d4 pawn.
Precisely. In both scenarios, white often gets a long-term target in that isolated pawn, while black gets more active pieces in central space in return. Understanding how white typically plays against the IQP and the Tarrasch gives you clues about how to handle similar structures arising via the Catalan. It's about recognizing those shared strategic ideas.
That's a great insight, seeing the overlap in pawn structures and strategic plans. And there was one more variation mentioned, the Catalan Benoni. What's that about?
Ah, yes. That's a bit less common, but definitely playable. It happens if black answers 1.d4, nf6, 2.c4, e6, 3.g3 with 3.c5 immediately.
Try to get a Benoni structure.
Yeah.
Like after 1.d4, nf6, 2.c4, c5, 3.d5, e6.
Kind of, yeah. Black aims for that asymmetrical pawn structure typical of the Benoni, looking for queenside counterplay. But the difference is white already has the bishop heading to g2, so that bishop is going to be sitting on that long diagonal, potentially putting pressure on black's setup from the get-go.
So it's like a Benoni, but with white's Catalan bishop already factored in. Sounds double-edged.
It definitely can be. More dynamic, maybe riskier for black compared to the standard Catalan lines, but offers chances for active counterplay if white isn't careful.
Okay, so the Catalan framework is really flexible, interacting with these other big opening ideas. Let's shift focus slightly. Our sources talk a lot about grandmaster insights. Who are the key players we should think about when studying the Catalan?
Well, we mentioned the historical figures Capablanca, Alekhine, Botvinnik, essential grounding. Then that Kasparov-Korchnoi match in '83 was huge for its modern revival.
Right.
And in the, more recent era, Kramnik's contributions were massive. He really refined a lot of lines and used it effectively in title matches. And Carlsen, as we said, has made it a pillar of his repertoire.
Are there other current top players strongly associated with that?
Oh, definitely. You see players like Fabiano Caruana using it, Anish Giri, Ding Liren, Daniel Dubov has played some very creative Catalans. It's firmly established in the toolbox of many elite GMs today. Each brings their own style and ideas to it.
And it's not just that they play it, right? It's that their games push the theory forward.
Absolutely. Catalan theory is constantly evolving. These top players, often aided by super strong computers, are always testing lines, finding new resources, challenging old assessments. It's very much a living opening.
And looking at their games helps illustrate the strategic concepts we discussed. Development, diagonal control, dealing with pawn structures.
Precisely. You see the theory in action. How they handle the tension in the open Catalan, how they maneuver in the closed lines, how they play against or with an isolated pawn if it arises from a Tarrasch transposition. Studying these games is probably the best way to deepen your understanding beyond the basic moves. You see the long-term plans unfold.
So, for you listening right now, why should you spend time getting to know the Catalan, even if you don't plan to play 1.d4 and 3x g3 yourself?
Well, a few reasons. If you play white, it's obviously a very solid, strategically rich opening choice. It offers chances for both quiet positional squeezes and more dynamic play, lots of depth there.
Okay, but what if you don't play it as white?
Even then, understanding it is super useful. Firstly, you will face it as black if you play 1.nf6 and 2.e6 against 1.d4. Knowing the ideas is crucial for defense. But secondly, and maybe more importantly, is the point about transpositions.
Right, you mentioned that earlier. Reaching Catalan-like positions from other openings.
Exactly. You might be playing, say, a Queen's Gambit decline or a Nimzo Indian, and suddenly the pawn structure and the piece placement start to look very much like a Catalan. Recognizing those patterns, understanding the typical plans associated with white's g2 bishop or black's potential queenside pressure, that knowledge is transferable. It helps you navigate positions you might not expect.
That's a really key takeaway. It broadens your general chess understanding.
Yeah.
And studying it helps with strategy overall.
I think so, yeah. The Catalan is a fantastic playground for learning about positional chess. Things like pawn structures, especially the IQP link we discussed, the power of bishops versus knights, controlling key squares and diagonals, balancing development versus material. It's all there. Working through Catalan ideas can really sharpen your strategic thinking overall.
Okay, this has been a fantastic exploration. To wrap things up, what are the absolute main takeaways about the Catalan opening?
I'd say. Remember, it's defined by that early g3 and bg2 fianchetto by white, usually after 1.d4 and f6, 2.c4, e6. It's named after Catalonia, popularized by Tartakower back in 1929. It has this rich history used by champions across decades. Strategically, think about the power of that g2 bishop, the tension between the open and closed variations, and its interesting links to openings like the Tarrasch. And it's very much alive and kicking in top-level chess today.
Great summary. It really pulls it all together.
Yeah.
Okay, and now for our final provocative thought for you, the listener. Think about how the Catalan mixes those classical ideas controlling the center with pawns early on, with more modern, hyper-modern concepts like the fianchettoed bishop controlling from afar. What does its lasting success tell us about how these different strategic styles blend and evolve in chess? Are there other openings you can think of that seem to bridge that classical hyper-modern gap so effectively? Definitely something to ponder as you continue your own chess journey. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.